The town of Oak Ridge had always been quiet. So quiet, in fact, that the silence often felt oppressive. It was a kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, and nothing much ever changed. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, where nothing out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen. But that was before the disappearances. I had lived in Oak Ridge for nearly a decade. After the war, I didn't have much of a choice about where to live. My injuries were enough to make the city life unbearable. The chaos, the noise, the people, I couldn't handle it. Oak Ridge, with its calm, sleepy nature, was a perfect place to hide away. So, I took up residence in a small house on the outskirts of town. A little piece of land, a dilapidated old house that needed more work than I could afford, but it was mine, and for the first few years, it was all I needed. That is, until Garrett Miller came into the picture. Garrett had been my neighbor for as long as I could remember, but it wasn't until recently that I began noticing something strange about him. He was always watching, always lurking. His eyes never seemed to blink, and when you met his gaze, you could feel something cold in the pit of your stomach. Garrett was a man who reveled in secrecy, a man who had a reputation for trouble. He had been in and out of jail a few times, and there were whispers that he had been involved in darker dealings. Things no one could quite prove, but everyone knew. But he had never bothered me until the last few months. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The strange noises outside my house late at night, the shadows moving across the walls when there was no one there. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe the trees swaying, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The paranoia started creeping in, and when I set up security cameras around my house, it only got worse. My security system was supposed to protect me. It was the one thing I could rely on, the one thing that would keep Garrett or anyone else from getting too close. But that didn't last long. The cameras began to malfunction. The feed would flicker, or worse, cut out entirely. At first, I thought it was just a technical glitch. I tried to fix it, but no matter how many times I adjusted the wires or replaced the batteries, it didn't stop. And then I started hearing footsteps outside. Footsteps that didn't belong to me. Garrett had always been unpredictable, but now he was downright disturbing. He would appear in my yard at odd hours, lurking in the shadows, staring at my house as if waiting for something. I would catch glimpses of him through the blinds, but when I went outside to confront him, he was always gone. There was no sound, no trace of him anywhere, but it was impossible to ignore the growing sense of dread that had taken root in my chest. I wasn't the only one who noticed. The town had begun to change. People were disappearing one by one, with no explanation. It started with Mrs. Lawson, the elderly widow who lived down the street. One morning, her house was empty. The door was wide open, and her rocking chair was gently swaying on the porch, as if she had just been sitting there a moment ago. But there was no sign of her, and no one had seen her leave. Then the grocer, Mr. Harris, vanished. He had been behind the counter just the night before, ringing up a customer, and then nothing, just gone. And then the school teacher, Mrs. Whitley. The disappearances kept piling up, and the sense of unease in Oak Ridge grew with each passing day. It wasn't long before I realized that Garrett was somehow connected to it all. My suspicions only deepened when I noticed something strange about him. He had become obsessed with my security cameras. He would stand outside my house for hours, staring up at them with a look that made my blood run cold. I caught him more than once trying to tamper with the cameras, scratching at the lenses with his dirty, gnarled hands, leaving smears of dark, viscous fluid that I couldn't identify. When I confronted him, he always had some excuse. He was just checking on me, making sure I was okay, making sure I wasn't causing any trouble. But his eyes always seemed to say something else, something darker, something that made my stomach twist in fear. And then Jessica, my niece, came to visit. I hadn't seen her in months, and her concern for me was palpable. She had heard about the disappearances, and she was afraid for me, afraid for the whole town. She had heard whispers of Garrett's involvement, whispers of strange rituals, dark magic, and twisted experiments. I tried to calm her fears, tried to tell her that she was overreacting, but deep down, I knew she was right. Garrett wasn't just watching me. He was watching all of us. And whatever it was that he was doing, it was spreading. One night, I decided to confront Garrett. I could no longer ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong, something far beyond his strange behavior and my malfunctioning cameras. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the cold night air, my crutches tapping against the wooden porch as I made my way to his house. When I arrived at Garrett's home, I was met by an unsettling silence. His porch light flickered weakly, and the windows were dark, almost as if no one was inside. But I knew better. Garrett was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, but still no response. I was about to turn and leave when I heard it, a faint sound, almost like a whisper, coming from the other side of the door. I didn't know what compelled me to open the door, but I did. I pushed it open slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, and stepped inside. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. The room was filled with the twisted, lifeless bodies of those who had vanished. The elderly widow, the grocer, the teacher, and more. Their faces were pale and vacant, their eyes hollow, their mouths frozen in silent screams. And standing among them, as if they were his puppets, was Garrett. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I felt my soul freeze. He didn't say a word, but I could feel the power radiating from him. The darkness that surrounded him was suffocating, and I knew then that he wasn't just some troubled man. He was something far worse. I tried to back away, but the door slammed shut behind me. Garrett raised his hand, and I could see the faintest flicker of movement in the shadows. The others, the missing townsfolk, were beginning to stir. They were no longer human. They were something else, something twisted and grotesque. Their eyes were empty, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were like puppets, their strings pulled by Garrett's dark will. I turned to run, but it was too late. Before I could make it to the door, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. I looked down and saw Garrett's hand, covered in that dark, viscous fluid, press against me. It was then that I understood. The ritual he had performed, the dark magic that had claimed the town, had finally reached me. The world began to blur around me as I felt my body grow weak, my breath shallow. I could hear Garrett's voice now, low and guttural, as he whispered words I couldn't understand. And then everything went black. When the police arrived, Oak Ridge was already gone. The town was empty, its streets silent, its homes abandoned. There was no trace of me, no sign of the horrors I had witnessed. And Garrett? He was never found either. It was as if the town had vanished into thin air, swallowed by the darkness that had taken it. No one remembers Oak Ridge. Not anymore. My name is lost, just another whisper in the wind, carried away by the shadows. But sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees, I hear the whispers of those who disappeared. I hear their voices calling out to me, lost and trapped in the same nightmare. And I know, deep down, that they're still out there, still waiting, still watching. And Garrett, wherever he is never far behind. The disappearing villagers of Hollow Creek had begun as a whisper, something the townspeople tried to ignore, attributing to accidents, bad luck, or the usual small-town gossip. But there was a tension now that no one could shake. It lingered like the fog that crept over the hills every morning, thick and suffocating. People were starting to disappear, not just the old and frail, but the young, the healthy, those who had never given anyone a reason to be suspicious. And with each disappearance, the town seemed to grow quieter, emptier, as if the very air was being drained of life. The first one to go was Mrs. Miller, the librarian. She had worked at the town library for over 30 years, a fixture in the community. Her absence left a hollow ache, a void that the library's dusty shelves couldn't fill. No one could remember the last time they'd seen her, but someone swore they'd seen her walking to the woods just the day before. That night, the police had searched her house, but it was as though she had vanished mid-step. Nothing out of place, just an eerie silence. Her car was still parked outside, untouched. Then came the baker, Mr. Shaw, a man with a deep belly laugh who always seemed to be covered in flour. He was the heart of the town's early mornings, always greeting everyone with a warm smile and a fresh batch of pastries. The morning after he disappeared, his bakery sat dark, the oven cold. The police found his apron hanging neatly on the hook behind the counter, and his shoes placed side by side under the table. But no sign of him, not a trace. Next was Mrs. Jennings, a school teacher. She had a soft voice, kind eyes, and a gentle way of making even the most restless children listen. Her disappearance was the one that caused the most concern, especially for the children. The classroom sat empty for days, a reminder of something unsettling that no one wanted to acknowledge. But even the mayor, usually so steadfast in his optimism, began to look over his shoulder, his face pale with worry. And then, just like that, the string of disappearances halted. For 2 weeks, there was silence. It was a kind of silence that felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. But then came the night when Emma, the florist, vanished. She had always been a calm, collected woman, with a warm smile and a graceful presence. The flowers she grew were said to have a magical quality, though no one could explain why. Her shop, nestled between the town's old mill and the general store, had been a haven of sweet smells and vibrant colors. But when Emma didn't show up for work the day after the last disappearance, it was a final straw. I had been in Hollow Creek for almost a week, trying to write a story about the strange occurrences that had plagued the town, but it was getting harder to pretend like I wasn't personally involved. The more I spoke to people, the more I felt like something was being hidden. There was a darkness in the air, an unspoken truth everyone was too afraid to acknowledge. I had never met Emma, but there was something about her disappearance that gnawed at me. Her house was just a few blocks away from the florist shop, and I knew I had to investigate. Armed with only my camera and notebook, I arrived at her home on the edge of town. It was dark already, and the streetlights flickered dimly overhead. The house sat back from the road, surrounded by overgrown ivy and tall trees that swayed with a breeze I couldn't feel. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint, floral scent drifted out, unusually strong for a house with no open windows. I hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the town's history bearing down on me. But I couldn't turn back now. I was too deep into this, and something inside me told me that Emma's disappearance was the key. I stepped inside. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and the faint smell of flowers thickened in the air, almost suffocating. The living room was a jumble of mismatched furniture, a few old paintings on the walls, and the remnants of what could have been a once warm, welcoming space. But it felt wrong. The house didn't feel empty, like a space abandoned, but more like it was holding something, watching me. As I moved deeper into the house, I pulled out my phone. The camera seemed to flicker, the image on the screen distorting briefly before returning to normal. At first, I thought it was just a glitch, a malfunction. But then I saw it, just for a split second, a shadow in the corner of the frame. Something that shouldn't have been there. A face distorted, half hidden beneath a hood. I stopped dead in my tracks. The air around me seemed to grow colder. I called out, "Emma, are you in there?" My voice felt too loud in the silence. From the darkness of the hallway came a voice, soft, almost as if it was struggling to form the words. "My car broke down. Can I use your phone?" I froze. It was a woman's voice, but something about it was wrong. The words didn't sound quite right. I took a cautious step forward, my heart pounding. I had to know who it was. Was it Emma? But then again, why hadn't she answered my earlier questions about where she'd gone? Why was she hiding in the dark? I reached for the door, my hand shaking. As I pushed it open, I saw her, a figure in a hooded cloak, standing motionless in the shadows. Her face was hidden, but her presence felt like it was consuming the very space around her. Before I could react, she lunged, grabbing me by the arm with a strength I hadn't expected. I tried to pull away, but it was like she had an iron grip. With a single, sharp pull, I was yanked inside. The door slammed shut behind me with finality that made my chest tighten. Panic surged through me. My mind raced, searching for a way out. But then, just as quickly, my thoughts seemed to fade. The room around me warped, and I could feel a pressure building in my skull, a strange buzzing, like hundreds of voices whispering at once. I turned, but there was nowhere to run. In the corners of the room, I saw them. Faces. Twisted, distorted faces, all staring at me from the shadows. Some were familiar, others were not, but they all had one thing in common, a look of unbearable longing. They were watching me as if they knew something I didn't, something I was about to learn the hard way. The last thing I remember before the darkness claimed me was a single word. It was whispered in my ear, soft and insistent. Welcome. When I woke, I was in the middle of the street under the flickering street lights. Hollow Creek was silent, unnervingly so. No one was around, not a single person in sight. My phone was gone. My camera, too. I could feel my heart racing in my chest. My thoughts a jumbled mess of confusion and fear. I stumbled to my feet and looked around. The house, Emma's house, was gone. In its place was just an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. I turned to the rest of the town. It was as if the world had shifted, like I no longer belonged to it. I looked down at my hands. There were no signs of injury, no scratches, no bruises, just a lingering sense of something wrong. When I walked into the town square, the clock tower struck midnight. A chill ran through me as I realized, with horror, that the town of Hollow Creek had no record of a James ever having existed. The people who had disappeared were all gone from memory, erased. I was the next, and soon no one would remember me either. As I looked at the empty houses and vacant streets, I realized that the town had never been a town at all. It was a trap, and I was just another one of its many victims, lost in the night, forgotten,